This week on The Futurists, Dr. Neal Baer.
We have to really help society and citizens understand that science is an iterative process, not one where we have all the answers right away, even though we want to have those answers.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tersick, and here's my co-host, Brett King. Hey, Brett.
Yeah, good to be back with you.
Good to see you again.
A couple of weeks in a row now. It's a good habit, right?
Yeah. Fun to finally get ourselves coordinated time-wise to be able to do this. Well, this is going to be an exciting show for us this week because Dr. Neal Baer is somebody I've admired his entire career. As you know, I've got a background in the media.
Sound like industry. A fanboy, bro.
I am a total fanboy. It's astonishing to me. Neal, welcome to the show. Welcome to The Futures. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Just by way of introduction, I want to talk a little bit about some of the milestones in your career. Now, for folks who are listening, if you're not familiar with Neal Baer, his bio is long enough to fill the entire episode. So I'm going to skim over some of the major highlights, but it goes deep and rich and wide. Neal wears many hats. He's a legendary showrunner in the TV industry. That means he's an executive producer of TV series, shows that the entire nation, frankly, the world has watched. ER, where he was a producer for 5 episodes and wrote 18 episodes. For 5 seasons, wrote 18 episodes, and was nominated for Emmys 5 times. Law and Order Special Victims Unit, which he was the executive producer of for a number of years.
Law and Order music.
Designated Survivor, Under the Dome, one of the biggest shows ever for that network. Really a remarkable career of achievement in the television industry. But here's what blows my mind, and this is why I'm so excited to talk to him. While he was producing these famous shows, he was also getting a degree as a medical doctor, as a pediatrician at Harvard Medical School. And this is one of the things I'm just trying to wrap my head around. Neal, tell me, how is it possible that you could be producing ER and also getting a degree at Harvard Medical School? Are you much of an overachiever? And we have overachievers on this show. That's sort of a high bar for us.
But that's a pretty high bar.
I'm pretty well organized. So actually, I was a TV writer before I went to medical school. So I wrote and directed, you may recall those after-school specials. I did that. And I worked on a show called China Beach. And then I decided when my son was a year old that maybe Hollywood wasn't the right direction for me. So I went back to Harvard to medical school. I had been there as a graduate student in sociology, and that's where I got my start making documentaries. And then I went to film school at the American Film Institute. And so I started writing and directing. Wasn't sure after I did those couple of shows, went back to Harvard. In my 4th year in medical school, I received Michael Crichton's pilot for ER that he had written around 1969 when he was a medical student at Harvard. Before he had just done Andromeda Strain as well, but he hadn't done Jurassic Park yet. So talk about the future. And so Michael wrote ER inspired by his experiences as a medical student at Harvard, and it lay dormant for about 25 years in a trunk in Spielberg's office. They found it. Spielberg remembered that he was going to do it maybe as a movie and thought it would make a good TV show. NBC did not like it. They thought it had too many stories. It was too much about the doctors. But Michael had done Jurassic Park by then, and Steven had done everything from E.T. to Saving Private Ryan to Schindler's List, on and on. Close Encounters, Jaws. So I was like, we better take this show. But it was predicted not to do well. It left the gate as this huge hit. I think the biggest hit of the last 30 years for a drama. And I started in year 1. So I was actually there for 7 years.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. So
15 seasons.
Yeah. So seven out of 15 seasons, the first 7. And what was really fun was bringing my experiences as a doctor in training. So I'm the first doctor writer in television, but actually I wasn't a doctor quite yet when we started. I was a medical student at Harvard. I went back and forth during hiatuses to finish medical school and then did my internship at Children's Hospital Los Angeles over about 6 years. And when I was doing notes on SVU, because it then bled into SVU, I would hide in the linen closet and the nurse would open the door and say, oh, he's doing his other thing right now. So I just managed to
Is that the thing?
yes, exactly. And I tried to
It's
keep it
astounding. So
simple.
you were an intern at Children's Hospital while you were working on while you were
While
executive
I was
producing
on
one
ER
series.
and SVU. While I was the
That's
showrunner of SVU and the showrunner the last year I was there at ER and an executive producer on ER. So I was always like being inspired by the actual work I was doing and drawing on it for ER. And that's really how it got started. So it was, luck. And I also say when people ask me, how do you get started in Hollywood and you write spec scripts? And I say, go to Holly Hills Elementary School in Denver, Colorado with John Wells, because I did. And we met in fourth grade and
Oh
he hired
wow.
me on
mm.
China Beach. And he hired me, he was the showrunner of ER. So he hired me
Oh,
on ER. And he had what I thought was a great idea was to bring real doctors onto
yeah,
the show for the
yeah,
first time, to be the writers, to
that's
bring
right.
to bring
Real
veracity.
technical.
Yeah, that
Exactly.
was one of the hallmarks of that show, and I remember people noticing it. Right, like reviewers would
Exactly.
comment on the accuracy or the
Exactly.
fidelity.
But you know what else is really cool that's kind of futuristic in a sense is that ER wouldn't exist in the way that it came about without a piece of equipment that had just been invented, which was the Steadicam.
Oh,
And so often people think that West Wing is like the origin of the Steadicam, those walk and talks, but really it's not. It's ER,
that's
and
right.
we had all the walk and talks. And Tommy Schlamme, who directed the pilot and was the directing producer of West Wing, he did a number of ERs, and he honed his craft in terms of the walk and talks on ER. And that's because the Steadicam was invented and the set was was a replica of a real defunct hospital in East LA. All we did was expand and widen the hallways so that they would accommodate cameras more. And we changed the floor from expensive hard tile to more of a linoleum so it wouldn't crack. But otherwise, it's pretty similar for the first couple years, then we would expand it and add to it. And it had great sight lines. But that Steadicam is what gave ER what we call the pace, and then we added pace and pathos. So without that new invention,
Yeah.
we would have had to lay dolly tracks and do all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff that would
Well,
make
it
it
also it gave it a more filmic look because it's like a
absolutely.
single camera, which people are used to seeing in a motion picture, but
That's
not
right.
TV usually has three cameras and there's a very conventional
Exactly.
style of cutting.
Exactly. So we were able to zoom around in a way and do oneers that would last for like 5, 6, 7 minutes, as long as
Mm.
the film. And we did shoot on film still, um, but
So that
it.
helps with the filmic part of
But
it.
we were, speaking of, technology, we did use the new system. So when I was on China Beach, when I did my China Beach episode, we still shot on film and edited on film, and we had an orchestra, and the composer was an amazing composer whose father was Arthur Rubinstein.
Mm.
So the composer would conduct an orchestra, and that's not done anymore. It was
No.
done for West Wing, but
Wow.
it wasn't done.
Mhm.
And so we have, the more, computerized
Yeah,
music now in the
non-linear
background.
editing of film of music. The those are back to the old days. So you've lived through tremendous transitions in two fields. One,
Huge.
the motion picture and television
And
industry. You've seen the rise of cable television, now the decline, and now the emergence of streaming, and now you're focused on social media, TikTok, YouTube, and so forth is
Right.
one aspect of what you're working on. But then, of course, at the same time, in your medical profession or your exposure to the medical field, you've seen tremendous increases and improvements there as well. But also, the trauma and the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you've seen it. You've seen the system come to a screeching halt or almost to the breaking point. That's quite a lot of experience, and that's not all. For the folks who are listening, in his copious amounts of spare time, Neal also finds time to do a great deal of volunteer work, particularly for the Venice Clinic, which I think is the biggest free clinic in the world, if I'm not, or at least in the United States.
Right. I did when I was in LA, so I'm not now because I'm not in LA. I live in Paris and Boston, but
Mhm.
I actually did one of my rotations there over 2 years because we had to do ambulatory medicine, and so at Harvard for 2 months. So I convinced Harvard that if I went every Saturday for 2 years, would you accept it? And they said, sure. So
Oh, cool.
Harvard's very flexible, but as you said, when I was in medical school from 91 to 95, I saw the scourge of AIDS and people
Mm.
dying, horrible deaths. And by the time I was uh, at Children's Hospital in the residency program, we could treat HIV and people weren't dying. And so that technology was profound. And we did that on ER. So I drew from that technology and made the first ongoing character with HIV who lived a successful life, Jeannie Boulet, played by the great actor Gloria Rubin. So that was the first time we saw someone live. There were shows where people died from AIDS, but we were the first to show someone living. And you may recall in the 90s, there was still a lot of fear, like, can you have a
I was
doctor
going to say
who has
that.
HIV? So we covered all that on the show. Now,
No, it's actually it's very close parallel to what we saw during COVID as well.
Exactly.
Like the lack of information and so forth, or the misinformation.
Right. And as we know more, then
Oh, yes.
we're better. I think this is a big problem for our, citizens, is that we really want definitive answers in science. We want definitive answers with COVID. We have pretty definitive answers for, say, measles. We know about vaccines. We know how well they work. We know what the terrible consequences of having measles can lead to, in terms of even death in children. We know how contagious it is, but we're still learning about COVID. We're still learning about long COVID. We're still learning about, I have a friend who just is young who had a pulmonary embolism, and he has no risk factors, and he had long COVID. And I said to him, let me look and see if there's any research on this. And sure enough, by going into the research, the literature, there is some literature now starting about, coming up about people who've had COVID and being more susceptible to having pulmonary embolisms, which, you didn't see before. So we have to really help society and citizens understand that science is an iterative process, not one where we have all the answers right away, even though we want to have those answers.
Neal, let me circle back to something that you mentioned, but I just want to underscore it for our audience, because I think some of the people listening might not be aware of this. They might not have been around at the time. In the 1980s, when AIDS became a crisis, it was a death sentence.
Absolutely.
Anyone who was diagnosed with AIDS, it was clear they were going to die. There was no way to stop it.
Except for Rob, a few people who had a mutation, and we're going to get into this with CRISPR. There were a few people who had a mutation where the virus wouldn't attach to the receptor, and they were not affected. And this is going to have a huge, huge impact on what we're going to talk about later with CRISPR.
That's cool. Actually, I'm kind of working my way around to that. So just to put a button on that last point, at the time in the 1980s, not just the medical establishment, but our political leadership was so flummoxed. They were so incapable of addressing what appeared to be an uncontrollable epidemic that there was actually some stigma around even talking about AIDS. And this might be historical information for some of our listeners, and for others, it might be new information. Our president at the time, Ronald Reagan, refused to mention the condition until I think 1987, like very late in his
his friend and his wife's, Nancy's friend, Rock Hudson, was dying of AIDS.
Yes.
And so as an actor, because Reagan was an actor, of course, and so was Nancy Reagan, they, in a sense, were compelled to, though others like Elizabeth Taylor and others who had worked with Rock Hudson as well came out and talked about it. So
at the time, there was a great deal of confusion in the United States. And there was also some, moralistic opining about AIDS and so forth. But there was a lot of confusion. And I think what happens when there's an epidemic is that the population is looking for leadership and they're looking for clear communication. I emphasize this because I want people who are listening to understand the climate when Neal took the bold step of introducing a character with AIDS who was able to survive, a survivor, because that was unknown to many people at the time. And it was actually kind of politically taboo to talk about that in the media. And what Neal did was a rather bold thing to do, but also demonstrates the power of media to reshape public perception about medical health crises and, frankly, about the medical profession in general. I think we could say that's a through line in your career. Many of the
Absolutely.
TV shows that you worked on, you handled complex medical scenarios or medical situations, and you found a way to communicate them to the general public that obviously enjoyed your shows. They were incredibly successful shows. Now, I characterize it that way because we were talking about COVID just a moment ago,
Right.
and we saw a similar kind of a repeat phenomenon where the president, at a time when the whole world was looking for leadership from the United States, we had a president who denied it, minimized it, tried to pretend that it wasn't going to be a big thing. It was nothing worse than a flu. He said these things, right? You can
Right. Even though he
inject.
got vaccinated.
Yes, I mean,
Yes.
eventually we did get the vaccine program running, and that was a moment of leadership. But I would say we saw kind of a repeat of that Reagan scenario
Yes.
where we had a president who didn't know what to say or how to message around it, and decided just not to deal with it or to deny it. Um, and in the meantime, of course, we had the media's world has changed a great deal. So during the COVID pandemic, there was an enormous amount of information available. That just wasn't the case during the AIDS crisis. So I think that that's an important milestone. It sets us up for some of the work that you're doing now, where
Right.
you're looking at how can media recast the understanding, public awareness of medical health. And so, I know we're running close to the break now. I'm not quite sure what we should do because we're building up to this. Can we get into this topic a little bit more in the second half of the show? Because I think it's a
Sure.
rich vein to mine.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, I
cool.
definitely want to talk about that crossover and the storytelling aspect and so forth as well.
But I have one
And the
other question.
implications,
I have one other
I,
question for you about this is it might seem a little bit off the wall, but as a writer, you've worked with people like Michael Crichton and Steven Spielberg, famous for their work in
amazing.
science fiction. Are you a fan of science fiction? Is that something that you've enjoyed reading about?
Yeah. I mean, I did Under the Dome, for
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And I had the great fortune of working with Stephen King. He was
Right.
the producer with me. I can't tell you a nicer person and a kinder person and a real,
Wow.
I've heard that about him. Yeah.
really, really, and brilliant. Just I could go on about Stephen King and Spielberg too. I mean, as I say, who gets to work with the two Stevens? But I
Yes.
did. And so it was great for Under the Dome because talk about sci-fi, but it was grounded sci-fi, so that I had to write about things that we could face, like what happens if we don't have access to insulin,
Mm.
So, because we're
Yeah.
under the dome
Yeah.
and one of our
Yeah.
characters has diabetes and she dies,
Hmm.
played by wonderful
Wow.
actor Samantha Mathis. Or what if we tried to penetrate the dome with the best, the most technologically advanced nuclear weapons? Didn't work. So how do we really think about fascism? That's really what Under the Dome is about, because Big Jim says he can run the trains on time. He knows the answers. He will make things work. So it's not just about the technology. That the sci-fi element gave us a grounding for exploring what actually some might feel is happening today. So I
Hmm.
think Stephen King saw that coming, and we were able to do that for the 3 years the show was on, which was really, really wonderful. And then we got into, how did the dome really get there? So of course that is
That's
sci-fi,
sci-fi. Yeah.
to the nth degree. So I think about it for the shows, some upcoming shows I'm working on CRISPR, which we can talk about as well. But I wanted to add that television still has trouble dealing with HIV/AIDS. So if you've seen shows coming, on now, you won't see characters with HIV except shows about the past. And
Mm.
my last show, Designated Survivor, starring Kiefer Sutherland, dealt with what we call U equals U. Undetectable equals untransmissible. And many, many people don't know that if you are undetectable, meaning you're taking your medication, you will not give HIV to someone else.
Hmm.
And if you take what's called PrEP, which is now going to be available instead of a daily pill, 2 vaccinations or 2 shots a year, you will not get HIV. It is so path-breaking, and
Wow.
yet people don't know about it. And so I was so fortunate that Netflix engaged with me to do that storyline. So we're still telling stories about technological advances that people don't know about.
In some cases, science fiction is a way to posit a what-if scenario. And
Absolutely.
many of the examples you just gave illustrate that quite well. We find that many of our guests on the show have this in common, that at an early age, they were inspired by science fiction and these what-if scenarios. And then as they grew up, they kind of pursued that in their own profession, very different professions from yours. So what we like to do to get to know our audience, or to get to know our guest a little bit better, is we like to do a thing called the lightning round. And
Great.
this is just a series of quick questions, just a short answer, whatever comes to your mind first. And Brett is the
I'll
person who
take it away.
administers poison. So go for it, Brett. This is the lightning round.
Great.
Okay, Neal, what was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to on TV or via media?
Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Oh, there you go. He's good at the lightning round, isn't he, Rob?
Yeah.
What
Creature features every week, every
Yeah.
Saturday on
I grew up watching Creature Feature too.
in Denver, Colorado. I mean, it came from outer space. Oh my gosh.
And of course, there's tons. All right, what technology has most changed humanity, do you think? This would be interesting.
I'm losing the lightning round here. I was going to say, antibacterial medication, but maybe sewage treatments and washing your hands.
Sanitation.
Summer White.
Yeah.
Because people weren't dying of, in childbirth and all kinds of things. So probably washing your hands. Summer White's work.
Yeah. Well, introducing that into the medical field, for example, was a big deal, right?
Huge,
it took a long time.
Huge.
Now, you've worked with some amazing people, right?
Yes.
You've mentioned some of them already, but can you name someone in particular, a futurist or an entrepreneur or a writer or someone that has really influenced you in your career, and why?
Well, a futurist writer would, of course, be Michael Crichton because just not only Andromeda Strain, but Jurassic Park, this is CRISPR.
Yeah.
And George Church at Harvard is CRISPRing, planning to make woolly mammoths,
yes,
that's right. Do some woolly mammoth work on elephants so that they can live in Siberia. So what Michael foresaw in particularly Jurassic Park and CRISPR and gene editing and changing DNA is profound. And that's had a profound influence because, as we'll talk about, that's my book. So
awesome. Well, we're going to get into that immediately after the break. Last question for the lightning round. What science fiction story is most representative of the future you would hope for?
Well, I would say something like 1984, because it gives us a warning. It tells us we have to be prepared. Yeah. We have to think, and we'll talk about that with CRISPR. So even though it's really upsetting and really scary, it lays out how we can be prepared, how we need to talk to each other.
Or conversely, it's an instruction manual for those who want to build that future.
Well, that's the other side of it, and that's what we'll talk about when we talk about dual use technology.
Okay, all right. Well, let's get into that after the break. You're listening to The Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King, with Rob Tursek. We have as our guest today Dr. Neal Baer, and we'll be right back after these kind words from our sponsors. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. And we are back with the Futurists. It's myself and Brett King and Rob Tursek. And this week we have an amazing guest, a Harvard-trained medical and media specialist. He's the co-director of the Masters in Science in Media, Medicine, and Health for Harvard Medical School, where he trained originally as a pediatrician. But of course, Dr. Neal also worked on TV, as we said in the first half, and movies. But he's just been an editor of a new book that's out, The Promise and Peril of CRISPR. We've talked about CRISPR on the show many times, but this brings together a group of really incredible, notable contributors. Alto Charo, a prominent bioethics and legal scholar, Marcy Daranovsky, Rosemary Garland-Thomas, some really interesting people, even Crystal Tsosi, a Navajo geneticist. So that's pretty unique, I would imagine, in terms of skill sets. Neal, first of all, before we get into CRISPR and the technology, tell us about how this project for the book came about and what the objective was.
It really comes about from a story, as all great, I think, technologies come from, which is I took care of kids when I was training in the residency program at Children's Hospital LA who have sickle cell disease, a horrible, horrible disease, shortened lifespan, strokes when they're children, just unrelenting pain, and very little we can do about it. And when I started to learn about CRISPR in gene editing, I learned that it may be possible to edit out the gene that was causing sickle cell disease and paste in literally the gene that would stop it. Well, lo and behold, CRISPR technology was growing. It literally came out of some scientists who worked in yogurt and noticed that bacteria was chopping up viruses, and some yogurt was going bad, some yogurt wasn't. And the reason is that the bacteria were able to chop up some viruses and do things. So this led to chopping up, DNA with enzymes and editing. And now we are able to, and this is in the news, so this is a very newsworthy episode. The first young man with sickle cell disease has just left the hospital cured. It's an arduous treatment, but he's cured.
Wow.
So, there are in fact already two sickle cell gene therapies in the market right now.
Right.
So
that's right. And they're very expensive. But there are 100,000 Black Americans in the United States with sickle cell disease, and there are probably over 8 million in the world. So we're going to have these treatments that are going to be expensive, at least at first, and who's going to get them? So that's going to be the ethical dilemma of CRISPR. That's the promise in my book, is treating sickle cell disease, beta thalassemia, some very rare protein folding diseases of the liver, some eye diseases that are genetic. There's 7,000 genetic diseases that we know of. There are probably many, 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 many more. So we're starting to learn how to do this by editing out. So for sickle cell disease, we turn on fetal hemoglobin, just to get just nerdy for one moment. When a fetus is in utero, it breathes its mother's oxygen through fetal hemoglobin that really attaches to oxygen. When we're born, that gene turns off and we have our normal hemoglobin. We are able to turn on fetal hemoglobin again using CRISPR in people who have sickle cell disease. It's amazing. So I was really interested in this technology because I saw people suffering. So that's the promise. We call it dual use technology. There's the really good. I can't imagine anybody who wouldn't want to treat kids who are in so much pain with a technology that will cure them. There are possible side effects. They're working on all those. We won't get into that,
but we need to administer the gene therapy to know the side effects.
Yes,
and so
and they've done, and they're doing really good work in that area. The peril is also in my book. So two people from Johns Hopkins, and they're the publisher of the book. Granville and West talk about bioweapons. Yes, we can make bioweapons without CRISPR. That's often an argument like, well,
We've talked about that on this
we
show
can already
numerous
do it.
times,
We can
actually.
already do it.
Yeah.
But CRISPR might make it easier. Can you imagine to make H5N1 more transmissible? It's, we talked about AIDS, we talked about COVID. There are people in Missouri who have contracted H5N1, maybe from each other. We got to be really on top of this now. So, so there's the possibility a rogue scientist could do some pretty nasty work. The other thing is when we talk about enhancement, you know, down the line, will we be able to enhance human beings? Will we be able to make them,
Augmented.
reportedly, Russia and China are doing research on making soldiers less fearful, not feeling pain. There are children born who have a mutation who don't feel pain.
Yeah.
Well, what if we do that with soldiers? What if we can look at some
Give
genes
them
that
gene
can
therapy
make
for that.
them not have to
It's
sleep
just a
as
flesh
much?
wound.
Yes,
Sorry.
exactly. So that's the peril. And then there's no gene that makes you smart or taller, but there's a number of genes, and so as we can't predict. We couldn't predict what fossil fuels would do. We've known for many years, but we didn't know in the 19th century. We didn't know in the early 20th century. We didn't know that plastics would pollute the oceans. We didn't know about microplastics.
Microplastics, yeah.
We know now things that we didn't know. And so to predict what CRISPR will do is really difficult. So that's why I brought up 1984.
So
How do
that
we talk about these things now?
those ethical considerations of experimental technology that can do so much good, eliminating diseases from the genome, curing people of debilitating conditions. Average life expectancy of someone with sickle cell anemia is 20 years shorter than the
Correct.
average lifespan. So, you can promote longevity. You give people better quality of life. All of those things. You look at that and you say there's no argument, but when you look at the potential misuse of CRISPR, we're not going to get every one of these drugs right. CRISPR is like using a sledgehammer on DNA right now. It's well, I mean, you give me your impression of this, Neal, in terms of how you think, how precise this technology is. But it seems like, there's a lot of progress that can be made. So how do you deal with those ethical conundrums of something that is so potentially helpful, but all of the unknowns that come along with it?
Well, we look at chemotherapy. We look at the history of medicine, which is really important to understand the future, to be able to think about it. What we do in treating cancer now is not what we did 10 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago. We're much better at it because it's not definitive, as I said at the beginning. It is iterative, it is ongoing, it is investigative. So that's what's really difficult to kind of make peace with. But we have to understand that. And so, but we don't want to injure people,
Right.
like what happened years ago with stem cell research. So there's been a lot of work on CRISPR to make sure that there aren't what's called off-target problems where other genes get targeted as well. And so as far as we know with the sickle cell treatments of the two people who've been cured, they are doing well. And what is the how do you benefit? How do you think about the cost and the benefits in terms of not financially, but in terms of suffering? Is it, how do we think about that ethically? So that's an issue. And then the other issue is just, of course, the affordability, as we talked about, when there's so many people who suffer.
I think it's like 450,000 for a year of treatments for the sickle cell stuff, or
oh no, much more expensive.
Oh, really?
It's between $2 and $3 million for the treatment for this for the CRISPR treatment. But what's the overall cost just in money for the lifetime of someone with sickle cell disease.
Yes.
1.6 million, that's covered usually by Medicare, and the other 50,000 out of pocket, often with people who can't afford it. So
Mhm.
it's really, and but I think there are about 200 to 250 children born every year in New York State with sickle cell disease, and 1 out of 13 Black Americans carries the gene. So then we get into like, should we be using CRISPR to
In vitro. Yeah.
get rid of sickle cell disease?
Mm.
That's a possibility. George Church from Harvard talks about that. There are two different types of CRISPR to think about. There's what's called somatic, where we treat the DNA, but you can't pass on the treatment to your offspring. So that would be like
Germline. Yeah.
turning on the fetal hemoglobin gene. Then there's what Dr. He did in China, and that's why he's talked about AIDS, because he made an embryo. We call that germline editing. Very different from somatic because it can be inherited. It's in the germline, it's in the reproductive cells. So he took an embryo and he made the receptor for HIV mutated so that the baby born would be resistant to HIV. And why he did that, you can read in the book. But then the embryo split into twins. And he was put in prison for this, and it raised an uproar around the world because now he was changing human evolution. And by that, I mean, he went in and changed this embryo so that that embryo would pass on if it had, once that embryo turned into a person, that person could have a baby and it would have that gene change in it.
Mhm. It would pass
So-
along to subsequent
And
generations.
how can we resist technology like that that's going to advance
Well, that is
It raises the ugly
genome of the
specter of
species.
that
eugenics.
is the question. That is really the fundamental question. And what's really interesting is in the book we talk about this. In 2015, all of the academies of sciences and medicine around the world in the United States were saying that we should have a moratorium on germline editing, and there was no reason to ever do it. Only somatic, like treating sickle cell disease, where you couldn't pass on what we have done. And then when Dr. Hood did this, they started to change their tune a bit and said, well, maybe there are times when we could edit an embryo. And so they have very smartly picked a scenario, and I'll tell you what the scenario is. It is that what if, and this could only be treated by CRISPR. So if we have people who have genetic diseases or traits, we can do something without CRISPR. We can do IVF and something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD. We can look at the embryo and not implant an embryo that has sickle cell disease or Tay-Sachs or those things, because these are diseases where the parents have the ability to make embryos or eggs that or an embryo that's fertilized that doesn't carry the disease.
But now you're playing the role of natural selection, right? So that's the danger.
There are couples who are deaf, and there's no way that genetically they can have a child who will be hearing. So there's a Russian scientist who's looking at this and saying it's not fair to this couple. They are deaf, but they want their child to be hearing. And so we should go in and change that embryo and change that little mutation, which we could do, and make them hear. So this is where science leads ethics, as Ben Hurlbut talks about. Should we start to say in these very unusual cases, okay, maybe.
So, Dr. Baer, let's dive into, like, you've worked in hospitals, you've worked in the medical industry, you've built stories like ER on the medical industry. And yet, what we're looking at here is a set of technologies now, not just CRISPR, but we're looking at artificial intelligence, personalized medicine, such as, the technology with mRNA that we've been using recently for cancer treatments, as well as of course, the COVID vaccine. There's so many compressed changes happening in medicine. And, we talk about these eras of medicine, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, and so forth. We've discussed this on the show. How do we transition the industry to embrace these things for CRISPR, for these sort of therapeutics that are gene therapy based? It seems to be this aligns somewhat with the existing medical infrastructure, but when you talk about AI-based diagnostics and these other things, there's so many potential
Right.
structural and treatment changes going. So how do you think about that problem set in terms of how we
Right.
navigate through that?
Well, that's a great question. It's a tough question, but that's why I developed a Master of Science degree program in Media Medicine and Health at Harvard Medical School. So we train graduate students to think about exactly what you're talking about. How do we tell stories drawing on the arts and humanities which influence people? We know from studies we did on ER, on HPV and cervical cancer, that people learned from our show. We published the first experimental study in a journal called Health Affairs that in 2001 on that. So we work with our graduate students to tell stories that are evidence-based, that have impact, that are researched, in any kind of modality, dance, poetry, drawing, using AI, documentary, to have these discussions
Mhm.
and inform people about what's not even on the horizon, but what's possible.
So
And
it's
so I
just getting
think
people acquainted with the topic,
exactly
and as you're doing quite well, showing both sides of the issue so that people can be
right,
familiar with what the dilemma or debate might be. That's actually a practice, right? That's a necessary practice. One of the things I just gleaned from your comments about CRISPR is the technology may be ready, and in technology, maybe it will achieve incredible, unthinkable results, but society is not ready, and our medical establishment may not be ready, or the regulatory environment may not be ready for
right,
this. I think the same is true in some respects for synthetic biology.
right,
Where the work in vaccines is great, but now they want to apply that same thing to cancer treatments,
right,
and this is going to encounter controversy. So one thing that you're helping maybe people in the medical field start to understand how to do is how to message publicly, how to take advantage of social media and other tools that are available for publication of ideas to begin to condition society to this dilemma and start to make awareness happen. I think that's important because everything we've been talking about so far, it keeps reminding me of the very ugly history of eugenics.
right,
Unfortunately, when we start talking about editing the germline, that's a theme that's going to come up and makes a lot of people queasy and uncomfortable. May as well address it head on, tell us why this is not the case, or tell us what the decision making process is so that we can be have some certainty that that won't occur. Are
right.
these the kinds of things that you're tackling at Harvard?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So in our book, Rosemary Garland Thompson and Sandra Sufian, Carol Patton, they all have written about eugenics.
Mm.
Rosemary calls it velvet eugenics. For instance,
Velvet eugenics.
because
That's
it's
good.
kind of soft. So, where do we draw the line? I don't think anyone would argue that they wouldn't want to have a child with Tay-Sachs. This is a disease that
Mm.
we know will kill the child very young in a horrible way, and they will suffer. No treatment, no cure. What do we do about Down syndrome? What do we do about
Mm.
albinism? We have an essay by a physician, a cardiologist from the University of UC San Francisco, Ethan Weiss, whose child was born with albinism. He says that he and his wife, if had they known, maybe if they had done PGD and in vitro, which is expensive and not many people can afford it, they might not have gone through with the pregnancy. But
Mm.
now having this child, they wouldn't think anything other than how blessed they are. So this raises really tough questions about, what does society think is the normal or correct or right kind of person.
Hmm.
You know, we could get rid of, through technology, people who have Down syndrome.
Yeah.
It happens often when people elect to have abortions who are carrying down fetuses. But we could do things to, quote, improve. I'm not saying we should do that at all. I'm saying we need to
Hmm.
think about this, and that's what our book really grapples with. You know, it's a slippery slope. Like,
Yeah.
no,
It opens a
how do
path
we think
towards
about
designer babies because
Yeah.
exactly? How do we
why
do we
stop there?
and
I want a child with blonde hair, or I
yeah,
want
and
to,
what's ideal? Aldo argues
So
that
let's, but Neil,
we shouldn't worry about it.
let's we like to get sci-fi at this part of the show. So let's think out to, I want to, combine these skills you've got,
Right.
give us a story of what life might be like in the 2040s or 2050s and how we will have got through this and how it will change humanity.
Okay. Um, what if we took the technology we know with CRISPR, and we know that human beings don't have certain enzymes or abilities to digest grass, tree bark, certain flowers, whatever, um, things that exist, but we just can't eat. And what if we don't have cattle in the way we used to because we can make the meat
Mm.
cell wise? So
Genetically
we're
identical.
not
Yeah.
genetically. So we're not like having cattle chew up all the grass all over the world. So and make methane. Not that the cattle industry won't be happy about that, but that's certainly doable in the future. So what if we use CRISPR and we try to figure out how to make people able to survive eating grass or things that they
Mm.
can't digest because we give them an enzyme to
plastic.
to do that.
Yeah.
Plastic, tree bark, need less water. We'll use CRISPR. We already do genetic manipulation of plants and animals. Of
Yeah.
course, so there are things to think about. People like to think about, like, we can make trees glow at night. That's
Mhm.
possible. And fluoresce, so we won't need electricity for lighting. I mean,
Like, yeah.
it's kind of boundless and beautiful and amazing, but it's also really frightening and alarming. But I do think that there's possibilities for changing human beings to make them, instead of changing the environment, and I'm not saying we shouldn't change the environment in terms of making it climate friendly, but maybe we might have to change people to make
Yeah. To make it
them
survivable. Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
that's where, if you really want to dig into the
Augmented
sci-fi,
humans. Yeah.
exactly, that's what I work on in my TV work, thinking about that.
Very cool.
Yeah, we've done enough damage to the environment that we may have to modify ourselves just to survive in the
Exactly.
world we create.
And we don't hear about that so much, right? But
Yeah.
let's think about that. That's not to say we shouldn't try to save the environment and keep animals from going extinct. Of course, is any animal going to go extinct if we can keep their DNA? I mean, and then let's go to the other thing I think about, which is really cool and really scary, which is, do you know what IVG is? In vitro
No.
gametogenesis. So let's do a
Ah.
show on that. All right, so some Japanese scientists working with mice took stem cells,
Stems.
pluripotent stem cells, and could kind of encourage them to become egg or sperm cells.
Hmm.
Goodbye to
Wow.
the three of us. Won't need men.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
that's the
so
end of us men. We're pretty much
yeah,
useless.
There's a TV show
yeah,
there.
Yeah.
that I'm working on it. So it's conceivable that women, so men could do. There was a really good piece in the New Yorker written about this a few years ago. There was a gay couple who's sponsoring this research because these two men want to have a child that could be biologically theirs, and so it's not doable, but it's definitely conceivable.
It's
Now
conceivable. Yeah.
We could use CRISPR to give, to make a child have some of, we couldn't do a for, a full child, but we could take if there are two dads who have their sperm and the mom's egg, and we CRISPR the dad with the other dad, we could do all kinds of things.
Hmm.
So I'm just putting it out there. It's not so far-fetched as you might think. And it makes you wonder, like, what is humanity? What do we mean by humanity? What does it mean to be a human being today and in the future? I don't know. I can't
Well,
imagine.
I think the one thing that probably you've illustrated quite well on this show is the fact that we are going to need to think about problems and the solutions to those problems with a higher order of consciousness and sense of community, because the
Definitely.
ability to reframe what it means to be human and the impact that that will have on society is daunting. And
Yes.
unless we have a plan, we can't just, it's not like we can just, let's try this gene editing out and see what happens. We really need a sort of a plan. But the problem with that is it comes back to sort of what ethical frameworks do we need for the species as a whole moving forward? And,
Right.
we can't agree on anything ethically right now as communities. You look at the
Yeah,
division in
there's
the
a
US over,
significant chunk of society that is against the future. Like they like
yeah,
the present
yeah.
and they like the past and they understand
Yeah.
it well and they would love to stay there. But progress continues. Progress is unstoppable. A few years back at
Right.
Singularity
It's
University, someone
inevitable.
took me aside. We were talking about genetic research, and they said, "Look, there are all sorts of moralistic reasons why the United States is going to be slow." And they said it's not going to stop us because we look at the world like a spotted cow. A spot would be a place that's heavily regulated. We'll just go to a place where there's no spots. There are
That's
plenty of
right.
jurisdictions where they welcome it.
That's
And we
right.
saw that with some other therapies, stem cell, for instance.
Right.
There was a period of time where you could get stem cell treatments in Argentina and
Right.
Thailand. You had medical tourism where people are going there.
Yeah.
So my
You
view
can
is
do
that
it now. You can do it now with mitochondrial uh, work not in the United States, but in like Mexico and the UK, where you can take a mother's mitochondria and put it into an egg if the mother who made the egg has mutated mitochondria. So there's stuff.
Neil,
There
do
is
you
a
think there's a
chapter. There's
possibility? Do you think there's a risk then that the United States will fall behind because we will not be at
no,
the forefront of these
no,
advances?
no. DARPA's even though politicians never talk about CRISPR, DARPA sure does.
Yeah.
But the chapter in our book on oversight is certainly really important because there really is not good oversight. People
Yeah.
can buy all kinds of pieces of DNA from companies. Companies are supposed to keep track of what they're selling, but there's no law that makes them. We need some international agreements.
Yeah, I mean, it's
This
just
is
that
like
it
arms
takes,
dealing.
but it takes
Absolutely.
an entirely new view of medicine and science moving
And
forward.
life.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
requires massive commitment to data, right?
Yep.
So the
Yep.
world gets like regulation of this is going to have to be based on data, right?
Yep.
And so how do you create that data infrastructure for this next generation health industry? We could talk about this forever, Neil. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's been
Thanks.
wonderful to have you on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for
Tell
having me.
us a bit more about the promise and peril of CRISPR. Where can people find out more about the book,
Great.
and where can people find out more about the projects you're working on?
Thank you. So, Promise and Peril is available through Johns Hopkins website and of course through Amazon and other book selling websites. So it's coming out audio in probably the next 6 months. So for those who like their science audio and their future auditorially, it's going to be available. In terms of my own work, I work on TV shows for Netflix in Europe, and am doing medical series still, and now planning to do some stuff that's more, sci-fi edge, grounded
Cool.
sci-fi, or whatever we
Mhm.
call it in Hollywood. Because I always like to do new things, and because I had done Under the Dome, it really whetted my appetite to do sort of more work in this area. So I'm hoping.
Well, when you're ready to
do that.
publish your sci-fi, or you're doing your sci-fi series, we want you back on because we love sci-fi
I
here.
will. Thank you. And then my master's degree program is on. You can find out about it online if you Google Media, Medicine, and Health Harvard, or we have an online program where people can do their projects that will improve health and well-being, and that's Media and Medicine Certificate Program at Harvard. So thank you for having me. It's been really fun to talk
Yeah.
about.
No,
about
we
Great fun to have you
appreciate
as well. Thank you very kindly, Neal, for joining the show. Brett, it's good to see you again. And to wrap up, I want to thank the folks at Provoke Media that make the show possible, including our producer, Elizabeth Severance, and our engineer, Kevin Hirschman, and the whole group at Provoke. Of course, I always love to thank our audience as well. We get good feedback from our listeners. People post questions and suggestions and ideas. Sometimes they challenge us on social media. We welcome that. That's good. We want to make this more of a conversation. So we welcome that. Every week on The Futurist, we're going to bring you someone who is thinking about and in their career doing their best to shape and influence the future in the directions that they envision. Neal's a good example of that. And we'll be back again next week with another Futurist. Until then, we will see you, Brett,
in the future.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.